The perimeter had been quiet for 4 hours. Then the trip flare on the northeast corner sputtered to life, and a young sentry, half asleep at his post, saw shapes moving in the wire. He didn't wait for a second confirmation. He squeezed the clacker in his hand, the same simple plastic firing device every American soldier in Vietnam carried, clipped to his gear, and somewhere out in the dark, a Claymore mine detonated exactly as it was designed to. 700 steel balls tore outward through the night, except the mine wasn't facing the wire anymore. Sometime after dusk, unseen, it had been turned around. The steel didn't go out toward the enemy, it came back through his own position. To understand how a defensive weapon became one of the most quietly feared threats an American soldier could face from his own equipment, we have to go back to a drafting table in New Jersey more than a decade before that mine ever left its crate. In the early 1950s, engineer Norman McLeod at the Picatinny Arsenal set out to solve a problem that had haunted American infantry since Korea. Human wave assaults, dozens or hundreds of enemy soldiers advancing shoulder to shoulder across open ground, could overwhelm a defensive line before conventional weapons had time to inflict enough casualties to break the momentum. McLeod's answer was a curved, rectangular mine, roughly the size and shape of a paperback book, packed with a layer of C4 explosive behind 700 steel balls embedded in resin. Detonated by command wire, not by a soldier stepping on it, the mine sprayed its payload outward in a 60-degree fan, lethal to a range of over 50 meters. It was named after the Scottish broadsword, the Claymore, a weapon built for cutting down a line of advancing men. By the time the M18A1 Claymore reached mass production in the early 1960s, it had one more feature bolted onto its design, specifically to prevent catastrophe. Raised plastic lettering across the convex face of every mine read 3 words: front toward enemy. It sounds almost absurd in its simplicity, an instruction so basic it seems unnecessary. That simplicity was the entire point. A tired soldier setting up a defensive perimeter in the dark, in the rain, exhausted from a day's patrol, needed a mine so foolproof that orientation errors were nearly impossible. What nobody fully accounted for was an enemy patient enough and unseen enough to walk up after that soldier had gone to sleep and turn the entire weapon around. By 1966, American units across South Vietnam were deploying Claymores as a standard part of every night defensive position. A 4-pound mine, a spool of 100 feet of wire, and a handheld clacker carried in an M7 bandolier by nearly every infantryman in country. Set along a perimeter, tied into interlocking fields of fire with M60 machine guns and rifle positions, the Claymore gave a small unit the ability to shred an entire assault wave in the opening seconds of a night ambush. It was cheap, portable, and required no maintenance beyond keeping the firing wire clear of mud. For a war fought overwhelmingly at night, in terrain where visibility might be measured in feet, the Claymore became as essential to a defensive position as the rifle each man carried. Training doctrine at the time treated the mine as close to infallible. Field manuals walked soldiers through wire placement, backblast clearance, and the 60-degree kill fan in exacting detail, but said almost nothing about what happened after the mine was set and the patrol moved on to sleep, eat, or rotate watch. The weapon was designed to be planted once and trusted completely until the moment it was needed. That single assumption, more than any flaw in the mine's engineering, was the vulnerability the enemy would eventually find and exploit with almost no additional equipment of their own. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army studied that reliance and found the seam in it. Villages throughout the contested regions of South Vietnam lived a double existence that American units struggled to fully grasp. A farmer working a rice paddy in daylight, waving to a passing patrol, might report to a Viet Cong cadre after dark. When American units set up a night position near a hamlet or moved through open ground in daylight to establish a perimeter, the placement of every Claymore along that line could be watched, memorized, and reported before the sun went down. Sappers, trained specifically in the infiltration, would move in after midnight, when the defending unit had settled into the low hum of watch rotations and exhaustion. Barefoot, moving in inches, they located the mines by feel along the firing wire and turned them. Not detonated. Turned. 180 degrees, so that front-toward enemy now faced the very Americans who had set it. The infiltration itself required a level of patience that ran counter to almost every instinct an assaulting force might have. A sapper capable of reaching a Claymore undetected had, by definition, already penetrated a defended American perimeter without triggering a single alarm, trip flare, or sentry challenge. Turning the mine and withdrawing without detonating it immediately meant leaving the position exactly as it had been found, betraying nothing, and trusting that hours later, in the chaos and adrenaline of a perceived attack, an American soldier would do the rest of the work himself. The unit lessons learned reports filed by American engineer battalions throughout 1967 make the fear explicit in language stripped of any dramatization. The 27th Engineer Battalion's quarterly report for the period ending October 31, 1967, states plainly that soldiers in the field had become afraid to detonate their own claymores. Not because the weapon had failed, because it had worked too well in the wrong direction, often enough that the fear had become institutional. Numerous incidents, the report noted, had already resulted in serious injuries to friendly forces from mines that had been turned around in the night. That fear changed behavior in ways that mattered tactically. Units began instituting mandatory daylight checks of every Claymore position before first light and again before dusk, tracing each firing wire by hand from the clacker to the mine itself to confirm orientation. Some units abandoned forward Claymore placement entirely in high-risk sectors, accepting a gap in their defensive plan rather than risk a reversed mine. Sentries were briefed to visually confirm a mine's aim, when possible, rather than trust memory from hours earlier. None of these precautions were foolproof. A sapper skilled enough to infiltrate a perimeter undetected in the first place was rarely stopped by a soldier glancing at a mine silhouette in the dark. The mechanism of a Claymore turning against its owner sounds almost supernatural described that way, a booby trap made from the defender's own equipment. The tactical logic behind it was ruthlessly practical. A reversed Claymore required no explosive smuggled through the wire, no timer, no risk of discovery during placement. The Viet Cong sapper needed only patience, darkness, and knowledge of exactly where the Americans had already done the work for them. When that sentry finally triggered his own perimeter defense, believing he was firing on an approaching enemy, the 700 steel balls traveled backward through his own position at roughly the same lethal velocity they were designed to deliver outward, and there was no way to know, in the instant before pulling a clacker in the dark, whether the mine downrange was still facing the wire or facing the man holding the firing device. That uncertainty, more than any single casualty count, was what the enemy had actually weaponized. The Viet Cong did not rely solely on reversing American ordnance. They fielded a directional mine of their own, less refined in manufacture, but built on the identical principle McLeod had pioneered for the U.S. Army. Officially cataloged by American intelligence as the DH-10, the mine resembled an oversized lollipop, a curved charge mounted on a swiveling wooden or metal frame that let the operator aim the blast with the same precision an American engineer could aim a Claymore. Packed with quarter-inch steel fragments embedded in a wax-like binding compound and fired through a simple pull-friction device, the DH-10 was crude by American manufacturing standards and every bit as lethal at close range. It confirmed something American intelligence officers were slow to fully internalize. The enemy did not need superior technology to exploit an American weapon's greatest strength. They needed only to understand it as well as the men who carried it. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The fear nobody put in the official history books. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. The scale of the danger mines posed to American forces in Vietnam went far beyond any single incident. Official tallies, acknowledged even at the time as almost certainly too conservative, credited mines and booby traps with a significant share of American casualties throughout the war, with some divisions reporting that roughly half of all hostile casualties in their sector came from mines rather than direct enemy fire. Buried in that broader statistic, difficult to separate cleanly, were the incidents where the mine responsible had originally belonged to the American unit it wounded. One case, documented years later by Douglas Kinnard, then commanding general of 2nd Field Force Artillery during multiple tours in Vietnam, illustrates how personal that statistic could become for a single American community. In the late summer of 1969, a battalion of the New Hampshire National Guard, activated and sent to Vietnam, lost 5 soldiers from the town of Manchester in a single mine detonation. The blast came on what should have been an unremarkable final day of their active duty rotation. The mine responsible for killing 5 men from the same town, men who likely knew each other before the war ever separated them by rank or unit, was American-made. It had been relayed by the enemy. Kinnard would later note simply that the effect on the unit and on the town of Manchester itself, receiving 5 bodies from a single incident on what should have been a homecoming, was devastating in a way that statistics alone could never fully convey. Colonel Sidney Barry, commanding a brigade of the 4th Infantry Division during this period, put the lesson into blunt operational language that filtered down through American units for the remainder of the war. Minefields, he warned, should only be planted after the most careful consideration, because they often did more damage to friendly forces than to the enemy they were meant to stop. Some units under his command stopped employing mines defensively altogether, accepting the tactical gap rather than the risk of arming an enemy with a weapon already primed, positioned, and aimed by American hands. Not every soldier who died to a reversed mine left behind a report detailed enough to reconstruct decades later. Most of these incidents survive only as a line item in a casualty log, a location, a date, a cause listed simply as friendly ordnance, misidentified or unexplained. The men who set those mines, and in some cases the men standing beside them when the mines fired, rarely got the chance to explain what had actually happened in the dark hours before dawn. By the later years of the war, doctrine around Claymore employment had shifted meaningfully from its early, almost casual deployment in 1965 and 1966. Engineers developed modified retrieval procedures. Units rotated mine positions more frequently, refusing to leave a Claymore in the same location for consecutive nights whenever tactically possible. Training emphasized burying or camouflaging firing wire more thoroughly, denying a sapper the tactile trail that made locating a mine in total darkness possible in the first place. None of it eliminated the threat. It simply acknowledged what the 27th Engineer Battalion had already written into an official report in the fall of 1967. The fear itself had become a weapon the enemy didn't even need to fire. The psychological toll of that fear is harder to quantify than any casualty figure, but veterans who served in heavily mined sectors described a specific, particular dread that had nothing to do with incoming fire. An assault could be heard, anticipated, returned. A reversed Claymore gave no warning at all. It waited, indistinguishable from every other mine on the line, until the very men who trusted it pulled the clacker themselves. The Claymore remained in American service long after Vietnam, carried today by soldiers who train on the same basic design McLeod finalized at Picatinny Arsenal, the same raised lettering warning front toward enemy still cast into its face. What changed permanently was the assumption behind it. No American unit today treats a defensive mine as a weapon that, once placed, can simply be trusted to remain exactly as it was left. That assumption died somewhere in the dark perimeters of Vietnam, one silently reversed mine at a time, in a war where the enemy's greatest advantage was rarely better weapons, but the patience to wait until the men who set the trap had gone to sleep beside it.